The summer of 1892 was the summer Gideon Crane spent 3 weeks digging a hole that his neighbors could not explain. Not a well, not a foundation. What Gideon Crane was digging, with a spade and a pickaxe and the particular unhurried rhythm of a man executing a decision rather than reconsidering it, was a root cellar, and the root cellar itself was not what his neighbors found inexplicable. Root cellars were common enough in that country. What was uncommon was the size. 14 feet deep, 9 feet wide, 7 feet high at the center of the arched split timber ceiling, large enough to stand in, large enough to store, by his own calculation, sufficient preserved goods and firewood for a household of 1 man and 1 dog through a winter of any severity the Mercer Valley had produced or that he had reason to anticipate. It was, by any reasonable assessment, larger than a single man required. This was what the neighbors said. Gideon Crane was 37 years old, a man of deliberate silences who had come to the Mercer Valley 6 years before from the river country of Ohio, where his father had been a river trader, and where watching rivers behave had given him a quality of environmental attention that did not translate easily into conversation, but produced, in the men who understood it, a specific kind of respect. A neighbor named Prosper Fenn stopped at the excavation in the second week and looked at what was being built. He asked what a man alone needed with a cellar that size. Gideon said, more than he currently had room for. Prosper drove on. What Prosper did not know was that Gideon had been reading the almanac records for 4 years, laying the atmospheric numbers side by side in his ledger, watching a pattern assemble itself that the valley had not seen in living memory. He was not certain. He was probable, and probability, to a man who had spent a childhood watching rivers behave, was sufficient reason to act before the event rather than after it. He spent $8 on timber and hardware. The labor was his own. He knew this the way a man knows something he cannot yet prove, that the winter the pattern described was not the winter the Mercer Valley was preparing for, and that the difference between what the valley was preparing for and what was coming would not be visible until the event arrived and settled the question for everyone at once. What he lacked was the season itself. It was coming. He filled it in the correct order, which is the order that a person uses when they have thought carefully about what February requires and have built the preparation against February rather than against November. Firewood first, against the east wall, split face out, stacked with air gaps to prevent rot, enough for 4 months of sustained burning at the rate his cast-iron stove required to maintain habitable temperature, not the outside wall stack that served in ordinary winters. Inside, where no ice accumulation would make access dangerous or impossible. Preserved goods on the shelves along the north and west walls, jars put up through July and August at quantities that exceeded his previous year's practice by the margin his almanac calculation required. Smoked meat on the ceiling hooks, dried beans and corn in sealed wooden boxes, joints fitted tight against moisture and mice. He kept a running inventory in the ledger. Every item noted quantity, location, estimated consumption rate, projected sufficiency date. The sufficiency date was the number he checked most often, and the number he checked it against was the duration estimate derived from the atmospheric pattern, revised upward twice since July as the autumn readings continued to confirm the direction. Pens supervised from the cellar entrance each morning, and moved inside when the evening temperature dropped, a reliable secondary thermometer that supplemented the one mounted on the interior wall. By the end of October, the cellar was full in the specific sense of containing what the plan required, organized for efficient access, with the door tested for its seal, and the ventilation gap in the upper north wall confirmed to be providing the airflow that prevented carbon dioxide accumulation in a sealed space. Prosper Fenn rode past on the last day of October and noted the organized interior through the open door. He observed that Gideon appeared to have put by enough for 3 winters. Gideon said he hoped one would be sufficient. Prosper Fenn laughed in the way of a man making a joke he does not fully understand. Gideon closed the cellar door and checked the seal. He was not ready to claim anything. But the cellar was full, the door was sound, and the winter had not yet arrived. He was, in the accounting sense of a man who has done what he set out to do, exactly where he had planned to be. The ice storm arrived on the 17th of November. It did not arrive as snow, which the valley knew how to manage. It arrived as rain, cold rain falling at above freezing temperature and freezing on contact with every surface it reached, building in layers with the patient accumulation of a process that does not hurry because it does not need to. By midnight of the first night, the valley was encased. The fences were encased. The trees were encased, branches carrying ice loads that the wood was not built to support, producing through the night the specific sound of timber failing under weight, the crack and crash of branches, and then whole trees giving up their structural integrity. The cabin walls were encased. The roads were glass. Gideon had moved to the cellar on the evening of the 17th, when the rain began, and the thermometer outside his cabin door read 34 degrees and was dropping. He moved methodically and without panic. He brought pen, the lantern, his bedroll, the almanac ledger, and 3 additional items placed beside the cabin door in October specifically for this contingency. The ice creepers for the boots, the heavy rope already run from the cabin door to the cellar entrance as a navigable line between the 2 structures in conditions that made visual navigation unreliable, and the hand axe for tasks requiring a smaller tool. He went through the rope line and closed the door. The cellar temperature read 38 degrees, the stable temperature of a space set 14 feet into the earth, insulated by the hillside on 3 sides, and the packed soil ceiling above, unaffected by the surface event except at the margins of the entrance door where the heavy weather stripping had been fitted in September. He lit the lantern. Pen settled on the bedroll. Gideon opened the ledger and noted the time, the exterior temperature from the last reading before he came in, and the cellar temperature. Then he checked the inventory against the sufficiency projections. He was, by the numbers, exactly where the plan had said he would need to be. The ice storm continued for 4 days. On the second day, through the cellar walls and the hillside above, he heard the sound of Prosper Fenn's largest outbuilding losing its roof to the ice load. He knew the building. He had noted its roof pitch 3 years before and had not commented because it was not his building and not his decision. He noted the time in the ledger. Nothing about the cellar's performance was surprising. Every part of it was working exactly as the plan had said it would work. Correct plans executed without deviation produced the outcomes they were built to produce. The cellar had held. The ice storm broke on the morning of the 21st. Gideon emerged from the cellar into a valley that was not the valley he had entered 4 days before. 3 inches of ice on every horizontal surface. The trees that had survived were sculptures. The trees that had not were down across the road, across the fences, across the divisions between properties. Prosper Fenn's outbuilding had collapsed. It had been carrying livestock feed and stored goods, and the collapse had mixed the two in a way that made assessment of what was recoverable a considerable undertaking. Gideon walked toward the settlement with the ice creepers on his boots and pen beside him, moving carefully on the glass road that the sun was beginning to work at the edges. What he found was a community assessing the cost of 4 days sealed without adequate preparation. Some families had managed, well-stocked pantries and sufficient indoor wood supply had carried them through cold and uncomfortable but sufficient. Others had consumed past their comfortable margin, and were calculating what the remaining winter looked like from a starting position lower than they had planned for. 3 families in the lower settlement were in genuine difficulty. Not emergency, but the compressed, anxious difficulty of households that have burned through their margin and are looking at February from a position that does not resolve comfortably. He made 3 deliveries that afternoon on the sled he had built for exactly this kind of winter transport, Penn working beside him. He sold from the surplus at cost, the cost of his materials, his labor, the value of what the cellar contained, not the price that 4 days sealed in an ice storm would have supported. The price a man charges when he understands the difference between having something others need and having permission to extract the maximum the need will bear. Word was still moving through the valley before he made the 3rd delivery. He could feel it the way a person feels weather before the clouds arrive, not in what people said, but in the quality of attention the settlement gave him when he moved through it that afternoon. The specific regard of people who are revising an assessment and have not yet completed the revision. He drove home on the rope line, updated the inventory against the deliveries, and confirmed that the remaining stock was sufficient through the winter by the projection built in July. That was, in the arithmetic of a valley that had been sealed for 4 days, considerably more than most. Prosper Fenn came to the cellar entrance on the Saturday after the storm broke. He came in the way of a man who has spent 4 days thinking about a conversation and has decided that beginning directly is the only approach that serves either party. He looked at the entrance, the heavy door on its sound hinges, the weather stripping intact, the rope line still running to the cabin, the ventilation gap where the cold air moved cleanly. He asked if he could look inside. Gideon opened the door. Prosper Fenn stood in the 14-foot deep, 9-foot wide cellar, dug by one man with a spade and a pickaxe across 3 weeks in August for $8 in materials. And he looked at the organized shelves, the firewood along the east wall, the hanging meat, the sealed boxes, the inventory ledger on the shelf by the door, and the thermometer on the north wall showing 38 degrees while the valley outside was still below freezing. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked how Gideon had known to build it at this size. Gideon showed him the almanac ledger, 4 years of atmospheric data, the pattern, the duration estimate, the inventory projections, the sufficiency calculations updated as the autumn readings confirmed the direction. He showed it without drama, without the editorializing that the situation might have seemed to invite, simply and specifically, as a person describes something they have tested and confirmed. Prosper read the ledger sections carefully. He asked how long the digging had taken. 3 weeks, Gideon said, August. Prosper said he had thought it was excessive. Gideon said he remembered. There was a pause that contained everything the conversation did not need to say. Prosper asked about the ceiling construction, the ventilation gap, the wood stacking method, the jar storage configuration, the inventory system, the rope line, the ice creepers, the door seal. He asked about all of it. Gideon answered all of it, with the patience of a man who has spent years being privately right about something, and is experiencing the public confirmation of it not as a triumph, but as a transfer of information, which was the more useful thing, and the thing he had intended all along. He noticed most things. He had noticed, in 4 years of almanac records, a pattern the valley was not watching for because the valley was not watching the records. He had noticed, in the shallow pitch of Prosper Fenn's outbuilding roof 3 years before, a structural vulnerability the ordinary winters had not yet exposed. He had noticed, in the November sky on the 17th, the arrival of the event the data had been describing, and he had been in the cellar with the door sealed and the inventory checked before the first layer of ice had set on the valley road. He had not been lucky. The ice had fallen on everyone equally. What had not been equal was what the ice found when it arrived, and what it found behind the door on the north-facing hillside was 38 degrees, an organized inventory, and a man who had built the answer to a question the valley had not yet thought to ask. He was, for the first time in the 6 years since he had come to the Mercer Valley from the river country of Ohio, exactly where he had meant to be. Not finished, the winter was not finished. Not comfortable, sufficiency was what he had built for, and sufficiency was what he had. But placed correctly. In a cellar that had held under the test, it was built to survive, with a ledger that had told the truth from August onward, and a neighbor standing in the doorway asking questions that would change how the Mercer Valley prepared for the following winter. Word was still moving. It had not stopped since the Saturday Prosper Fenn stood inside the entrance and asked how long it had taken to dig. And in the spring, when the planning conversations of a valley that had been sealed for 4 days turned to root cellars, their size, their depth, their door construction, their inventory methodology. More than a few of those conversations began with a reference to a cellar on the north-facing hillside that had cost $8 and 3 weeks of August labor. It was, all things considered, not an excessive cellar. It was exactly the right size.